We're looking here at the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, which is a very ancient landscape, being as it is part of the Appalachian Mountains. I thought that this would be a good place to start our discussion today of a topic that also involves long periods of time, the topic of evolution and how it relates to ecology. Let's begin our discussion by looking at some long dead birds that now exist as museum specimens at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. If you look at these three individuals here, these are three Eskimo curlews, species which may or may not be extinct, that I've been studying for the last few years. If you look at them, you'll notice that they're not quite exactly the same. They're three spring individuals of different sexes, and so sex plays a role in some of that subtle difference between them, but also there is simply individual difference between them, and the ultimate source of that individual variation, we could say, is mutation. But within any particular individual, mutation didn't have to occur. The mutation may have given rise to a series of forms of genes, those things we call alleles, and different individuals may have simply inherited different alleles from their parents. So consequently, there is individual variation within populations. And that's what natural selection is acting upon, is that variation from one individual to a next. Which of those forms of variation turns out to be the most successful ones for surviving in the environment? If the environment changes over time, which of those alleles is going to confer individuals the greatest advantage in moving into this changing environment? Let's look at a couple individuals where we can see a fairly clear difference between them. One thing I've been looking at, I've looked at about 100 Eskimo curlews now, is to look at the size of their beaks. I've been looking at a number of different things: the length of their wings, the length of their tails, the length of their middle toe, the length of their tarsus, which is that area of leg that we see without feathers on it. It actually would correspond to part of your foot, however. And so if we look at different Eskimo curlews, one of the things that is obvious is that the beaks can vary quite a bit in size. Some of that we could ascribe to adult versus juvenile. Some of it has to do with male versus female, but some of it is related just to variation among individuals. Look at this next individual, for example. Notice that its bill is much shorter than the last one. And I've been surprised as I've been examining these specimens, all of which are 100 to 150 years old, by the way. I've been impressed with how much individual variation there is. These specimens, by the way, were all collected during a time when Eskimo curlews still had fairly substantial North American populations. And so they are representative of a fairly large gene pool. But of course, as we get toward that time when they all disappeared, in the early years of the 20th century, the last specimen I've been able to find was collected in 1918. By that time, now we're talking about a gene pool which is a fraction of the size of the original gene pool that the population might have had when it was at its peak numbers. So again, all these kinds of issues fall under the heading of what we could call evolutionary ecology. We can ask ourselves, among those Eskimo curlews, which traits, long beak, short beak, which one would give an individual the greatest advantage in survival from one generation to the next? And we might ask ourselves the question, if environments were changing for this or any other species, which direction would bill size head? That's referred to by evolutionists as directional selection, by the way. And within the field of evolution, 3 kinds of natural selection are recognized. That first one, directional selection. But we can also find other kinds of instances in nature where the average individual within a population is the one that has the greatest advantage. And in that situation, the center of a range of variation is selected over time. That would be referred to as stabilizing selection. In certain kinds of instances, the individuals at the edges of a distribution, individuals, for example, who have the biggest and the smallest beaks within some bird species, those might be the ones who over time come to prevail in populations. That kind of a phenomenon is referred to as disruptive selection, and that can actually lead to the evolution of new species. That probably explains the evolution of some of the birds on the Hawaiian Islands, for example, or the kinds of species that we find today in the Galapagos Islands. Some of them may have arisen via disruptive selection. Now, as we look at this island bird right here, the nightingale reed warbler, this is a species that illustrates several other kinds of phenomena that can occur over the course of evolutionary history. Its ancestors, from mainland Asia, perhaps, are relatively tiny marsh birds. Many of them, or at least many of the members of this reed warbler group, are marsh birds, as you might expect from their name, reed warbler. But this guy is pretty big. You can see in comparison to my fingers, he's a pretty good sized bird, robin size kind of a thing. That phenomenon of species that get to islands getting larger is a phenomenon known as gigantism, and you see it in a number of island species. This is simply one example. The giant tortoises of the Galapagos are another example. It has developed a lifestyle that fits the environments that it found itself in. It does indeed, even on the islands that it's present on, use some marshy kinds of areas like its ancestors did, but for the most part it's evolved into an upland bird, because upland is what is on these islands. And so it's developed a lifestyle that fits living in upland, shrubby kinds of vegetation, edges of forests, where it can find insects and lizards and medium-sized kinds of food to eat. And we can also draw a parallel between it and other species found in other parts of the world, like our North American catbird. They even have similar voices, which is kind of remarkable. Birds on opposite sides of the planet coming up with similar voices, even though they're completely unrelated to each other. They live in similar kinds of places, shrubby kinds of areas, forest borders. They eat medium-sized kinds of bugs, and they have this very loud, kind of raucous voice in both instances. And so they have converged on a similar kind of a lifestyle. And this kind of a phenomenon is referred to as ecological convergence. And there are many, many examples of this around the world. Another phenomenon, of which there are many examples in nature, is this one, called coevolution. It refers to situations where species evolve together. One's characteristics influence the evolutionary pathway of the other species. And we see one example here from the tropical Pacific, two island birds that live together in the same rainforest kind of habitat. In this kind of a situation, we have the upper species, the rufous fantail, which is named the fantail because of that wide-spreading tail that they have got. They often fan it out like that, in fact. And the other species is the golden white-eye. Now the golden white-eye is a little bit bigger, and it primarily feeds upon insects that it finds on the undersurfaces of leaves and places like that in the forest canopy. The fantail, in contrast, flutters out from branches and captures flying insects. And so these two species feed in significantly different ways, yet they have, over evolutionary time, learned, I suppose you could say, to feed together. Now, the way this works is that the golden white-eye hops along branches, and as it does so, feeding on insects, it tends to flush flying insects off the branches, off the leaves and things like that. And so the fantail follows, several feet behind it, and as these insects flush off, it flutters out and grabs them. And then it comes back, and the two birds continue on feeding together. And this is a very typical kind of a phenomenon that one sees in these forests. They do it together all the time. So this would involve the species not just learning to do this, but becoming adapted to do this over time, so that one species recognizes the other one, is stimulated by the other one to engage in this kind of behavior. We can also think of this feeding relationship as an example of mutualism. That situation where species activities benefit each other. In this case, the fantail benefits by the food, which is being flushed by the white-eye, but the white-eye also benefits because the fantail is loudly vocal and serves as another set of eyes looking out for and alerting other species to the presence of predators. Now, in what is perhaps a more classic case of coevolution among organisms is this one. We're looking here at a hummingbird. This is the ruby-throated hummingbird. This is a female, so she doesn't have that red chin, but this is a species that is quite common all across the Northeast, and it is highly specialized for feeding on flowers. Notice it has this long, thin bill, and if you look very carefully at the tip of the bill, you'll see this little thing projecting out. That's actually its tongue. The tongue folds over to form something like a straw, and that straw can then drink nectar from flowers. So let's take a look at some of the kinds of flowers that hummingbirds specialize in feeding from. This, for example, is a garden daylily, a cultivated plant, but one that has the kind of shape that hummingbirds are attracted to. It has that deep tube in the center, and the hummingbird can take that long beak and it can insert it into a flower like that and drink its nectar. So we have many kinds of cultivated flowers like this in our garden, and consequently we have a number of families of hummingbirds that live in our yard every year. Other kinds of plants like this one, a kind of a lobelia with these long tubular kind of flowers, Hummingbird bills are ideal for being inserted into flowers like that to drink out the nectar. Now let's change our focus again. What we're looking at here is the nest of the rufous fantail. It is, as you might guess from the size of those leaves that it's next to, a rather small nest, only a couple inches across. And notice that it only has 2 eggs in it. That is the standard clutch of eggs for the rufous fantail. Let's compare that, however, to a different species of bird. Now we're looking at the nest of the North American wild turkey. And this is, of course, a much bigger bird than a fantail. However, what's interesting here is not the size of the birds, but the size of the clutch of eggs. If we start counting here, look how many turkey eggs we see here. 3, 6, 9, 12, 13 eggs. So a lot more eggs in a turkey nest than in a fantail nest. And indeed, if we look at the whole panorama of birds, there's many species that lay 2 or 3 eggs, but then there are others that can have very large clutches of eggs, and the turkey is one of those. Now let's take a look at an even more extreme kind of a situation. In this case, we're not looking at bird eggs, however, we are looking at salamander eggs. This is an egg mass of a spotted salamander, a species that's widespread in eastern North America. In this case, we're looking at a mass of eggs that numbers somewhere up around 100. You can actually see the embryos starting to develop in the very center of those eggs. So as we go from very tiny numbers of eggs to larger numbers of eggs, what is the point that I'm trying to make? My point is this. In some instances, species have evolved to produce relatively few young, but to invest a lot of energy into each one so that its probability of survival is rather high. Birds as a group in general tend to be more towards that end of the spectrum. Birds tend to have relatively few young. Even a turkey's clutch of 13 eggs is still relatively few young compared to some other kinds of animals. And this kind of a phenomenon is referred to among evolutionary ecologists as being a K-selected species, a species that invests a lot of energy in few young to maximize their probability of survival to reproductive age. At the other end of the spectrum are species referred to as R-selected species. And the salamander that you see in this photograph here is the spotted salamander that laid the eggs that was in our last photograph. Amphibians frequently tend to be more towards the R-selected end of things, where they lay many eggs, but most of the eggs do not survive to adulthood. Most of them tend to get eaten by predators or be placed in locations where they don't develop, things like that. And the adults don't invest much energy in the young in terms of parental care and things like that. Salamanders do not display parental care, and so the young are pretty much on their own once they hatch, and so their probability of survival tends to be rather low. And so this spectrum of events, from lots of energy being expended and few young being produced, to not much energy being expended and lots of young being produced, that is the spectrum of R and K selection. Now, this sort of phenomenon is true not just of animals, but also plants. So, for example, we're looking here at a very primitive kind of a plant. This is called Lycopodium, which is a descendant of those kinds of plants that would have formed the forests of Carboniferous times, hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, this very primitive plant dates from a time during which plants had not yet evolved flowers, and what they used instead as reproductive structures are these cone-like whitish things that you see here. These are called strobili, and these contain within them countless numbers of spores, these tiny little reproductive structures that can blow on the wind and land on a surface and then go through a rather complex series of events to grow another lycopodium plant. Let's contrast this sort of primitive plant means of reproducing with something from a more advanced plant. This is a modern plant called bunchberry in the genus Cornus, the same genus that contains the dogwoods. This, however, unlike most of the dogwoods that you might be familiar with, is a small herbaceous species found particularly commonly in northern forests in North America. Now, you notice in this case, this modern flowering plant has produced several fruits, and within those fruits there are some seeds, but not millions or even thousands, but a handful. So in this case, the plant is investing more energy in each seed so that its probability of successfully landing somewhere and germinating and developing into a new plant is much higher than any one of those individual spores of the lycopodium. So you might be asking yourself, well, in what way is this plant investing energy? Well, these fruits that you see are one investment. It does take energy to develop this structure. And what is the purpose of a fruit? The purpose of a fruit is to attract an animal to carry off that seed and plant it somewhere. The fruit itself is something that an animal might want to eat, and in the process of eating that fleshy fruit, it will disperse the seeds. So indeed, this plant has invested energy. And if we look at the seed itself, it is a little package of stored energy in the form of tissue referred to as endosperm, which is highly nutritious material that plants provide the embryo with in order to provide the fuel for its initial growth. So higher plants do indeed invest a lot more energy into each one of their seeds than do primitive plants. And with that, we are now going to change our focus still again. We've now completed pretty much what I want to say about evolutionary ecology, and we're going to look at evolution of a different sort now. And this is how it is that ecosystems evolve, change over time. And so we are going to discuss this under the heading of succession. Succession is defined as the orderly kind of a process that plant communities tend to go through over time until they reach a state which is self-sustaining, the so-called climax stage or steady state stage. There are two kinds of succession that are recognized by ecologists. The first kind is called primary succession. This is the kind of succession that occurs in a landscape that is for the first time being colonized by living organisms. It's that series of events that occurs after that time, from colonization to that point at which it reaches what we might refer to then again as a climax community. Secondary succession, in contrast, refers to the kind of succession that goes on in a plant community after it's been disturbed. So what you see in this image here, for example, is a forest that's had its canopy die off. These are hemlock trees that were killed by an insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid, which has been advancing up the Appalachians into the northeastern part of the country and wiping out hemlocks as it goes. It's a alien pest which has invaded our North American forests, and hemlocks are not doing well with it. So this kind of disturbance opens up the forest canopy to sunlight, and then what you see coming up in the understory are trees taking advantage of that. You have this dense mass of black birches coming up in the sunlight, which is now reaching the forest floor after the death of all these hemlocks. Now here is that same vicinity about a decade before the hemlock die-off. Here again we have mature hemlock trees, but now in this case the only thing that you can see in the understory are some sapling hemlock trees. Hemlock is a species that reproduces well in its own shade, and so it's one of those species that comes in very mature systems because it can replace itself. And so hemlock communities approach that steady state kind of a situation. Hemlock is one of the longest lived species in northeastern North America, attaining ages of up to 600 years. And so they do come to predominate in certain kinds of situations which have been undisturbed for long periods of time. You can see in this image here of an old growth stand a number of quite old hemlocks, all of them in the vicinity of perhaps 200 years old. And there is even one individual in this stand that might be as old as 500 or 600 years. Very slow growing trees, but as I said, quite shade tolerant, and often, as you can see in this photo here also, one of the few things that will come up under the shade of these mature hemlocks are other seedling hemlocks. So, once again, to summarize, primary succession is the development of plant communities that occurs after the initial colonization of a mineral substrate by plant species. There is this sequence of colonizations that occurs, certain species colonizing first and then other species coming in as the site is modified by the colonizing species. Secondary succession is succession that occurs after some sort of disturbance, be it storms or fires or insect damage or a whole host of other kinds of things, including human disturbance. Then a plant community starts to recover from that disturbance by being colonized by certain species that are capable of tolerating these new conditions. And then over a series of years, the community evolves toward some other state. When communities, either primary or secondary successional communities, are undisturbed long enough, they may approach a steady state kind of a situation, a climax community. And so that's where we're going to end today. However, I still have quite a bit more to say about this topic, so we will continue on with it next time.